Every single series in the second round has proven to be a little closer than expected. A whole lot to talk about on today's edition of Locked On NHL.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. I am Nick Zararis, host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodes, host of Locked On Penguin. Before we get to today's show, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, just like last week, we're going to bounce around. We're going to touch on all four series, and then the final segment will hit the power rankings themselves. Starting out tonight, we have two games. We have Rangers Hurricanes, we have Oilers Canucks. We'll start with Rangers Canes because that's the one that's reaching that crucial inflection point. You're at a game 6 after a team got out to a 3-0 lead. I don't want to say it feels like the Rangers are worried, but this is definitely the most flustered the Rangers have been at any point in the entire season. I mean, when you win a President's Trophy, you don't go through a lot of adversity in the regular season, and they haven't played great, frankly. Game 5 was the worst game they've played probably since the middle of March, like pre-trade deadline. And it's really discouraging that they had a 1-0 lead in the third period of an elimination game, and then Hurricanes scored 4 straight goals. Just, it's hard to not feel like that's going to have some type of impact on the team.
I think with this series, I don't want to sound like I have copium or anything like that, but it felt like the Hurricanes didn't deserve to be fully down 3-0 just because of the way those 3 games were, Nick. They were really close games, and the Rangers, they won by just a hair. The Hurricanes were in all 3 of those games. They played
2 overtime games. Yeah.
Right, decently well, but the Rangers got the bounces. They won the special teams battle, and they got the goaltending, and they went up 3-0. But the Hurricanes were in those games. You had game 4 down in Raleigh. Rangers come back to tie, but then the Hurricanes win it in the final few minutes before that game was going to go to overtime. They get a big win there, and then they just flat out dominated the Rangers in game 5, especially in the third period. You're right. They kind of just fell asleep in the third. They were honestly playing like a team that felt like, oh, we've already won this series. They're not going to make a push down 1-0 in the third. We're just going to coast to victory in this game. And the Hurricanes are like, nope, we're not going to do that. Jordan Stahl has a very 2009 Penguins type goal in the third period. It very much reminded me of one of his goals from the 2009 Stanley Cup final against the Red Wings. And then all Carolina's big guns showed up in the third, and they send this back to Raleigh. And at this point, there's more pressure on the Rangers than there is on the Hurricanes. You lose this game in Raleigh, there's going to be a lot of nervous Rangers fans at MSG this weekend for Game 7. And then the Hurricanes, if they're able to force a Game 7, they're thinking like, okay, we almost have nothing to lose just because we've now won 3 straight. We have the momentum riding into Game 7. The pressure continues to be all on the Rangers. Sure, there'll be some pressure on the Hurricanes because they now have a chance to close out this series, but most of the pressure would be on the Rangers. So I'm curious to see how they bounce back tonight. I saw they went back to Miller Trouba during practice on Wednesday. Nick, I got to say, don't understand why they're doing that, but I mean, I'm not Peter Laviolette.
To answer your question, I'll tell you why. They refuse to accept that Trouba's their worst defenseman. That's the issue here. You see the difference, and we're about to talk about Edmonton and Vancouver. Chris Knobloch was honest. He looked down his bench and said, Nurse is getting me killed out there. I've got to cut his minutes. And he played 2 fewer minutes in Game 4 than Game 3. Yeah. The Rangers see Trouba and Gustafsson struggling, and instead of saying, I need to either get one of them out of the lineup entirely and maybe look at Zach Jones, or saying, hey, we're struggling defensively. The big issue for the Rangers is that the Fox-Lindgren pair isn't working because Fox is very clearly not 100%, and Ryan Lindgren he's not good enough to really do a lot by himself without Fox being himself. I don't think this would be nearly as much of an issue for the Rangers if that first pair was playing like it was typically capable of. But with that pair kind of dicey right now, I understand why they're doing it. I just disagree with how they're going about doing it because Miller's been their best defenseman in this series. And you are telling him, we need you to babysit the captain of the team, the guy who makes $8 million, We need you to carry him to passable results. And I know they'll probably end up going back to the other configuration of the defense if they go back to MSG on Saturday. This is a lot of not having last change and needing to protect those guys, because if they're out there against Aho and Svechnikov and Gensel, they're going to get killed. So that, speaking of Darnell Nurse, who I just brought up, shifting gears over to Edmonton, Vancouver, that series has been a real slog. Low scoring, not a lot of space. Neither goalie with a whole lot of with a proven track record of success. Two coaches who are pretty new in their jobs, and a lot of guys on Edmonton are just there, and a lot of guys on Vancouver are just there. There have been a lot of passengers on both teams. You heard Tocchet say it about the Canucks after the game the other night. You can't win in the playoff with 6 or 7 guys just going through the motions out there. That series has probably been the closest in this round. And it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of separation between the two teams. And the last thing I'll say, neither of those teams have played particularly well. Those games have been ugly because there's just not a lot of successful hockey plays going on. It's a lot of clunky, disjointed, failed breakouts, sustained zone time with no chance coming off of it. It's been a very close series.
You saw Tocchet send a big message to Elias Pettersson after game 4. He was not happy with the way he played. And I don't think he's been happy with the way he's played all playoffs. You can kind of feel it building up when you listen or watch his media availabilities after games. And I think he hit his breaking point there and was like, okay, Elias, we need more out of you if we want to win this series. And in terms of how this series has gone overall, I don't think it's a hot take to say that Edmonton has carried a good chunk of the play against Vancouver throughout this series, but where Vancouver's been able to strike back is that they've been able to carry play in the third period. I think they've been the better team in every third period of this series for the most part, and Edmonton kind of just goes into a shell once Vancouver starts that big push in the third. You saw it in game 4. It looked like Edmonton is controlling everything for the first couple of periods, and then Vancouver has one heck of a third period. They fully push, tie the game, and then you know what happened in the final minute. Edmonton gets the game winner. But Vancouver has that ability to turn it on when they're down. They just need to play like that for the first 40 minutes, I think, if they want to win this series. But if this doesn't go 7 games, you can fire me to the sun. This series deserves 7 games. I mean, McDavid is playing mostly very great. Draisaitl's been on fire.
Draisaitl's the Conn Smythe guy right now. He's been the best player in these playoffs.
Oh, for sure. He's been
incredible, both at even strength and on the power play. I mean, the way the Oilers power play operates, it's been a real treat to cover the Oilers for the last month, because that power play is one of the most unique things in the entire sport, because their quarterback is constantly moving. It's not the traditional defenseman holding the point. It's McDavid skating the perimeter of the zone, waiting for the play to develop. It's just beautiful. And one last thing on that series.
Watch McDavid move around with the puck on his stick. You can't defend it. And the way they move the puck around in the offensive zone, you're always on your toes. You don't even know what lane to get in to try to block a shot. It's just not fair when you take penalties against them. You're probably just going to get scored on. Honestly, at this point, 99% of the time with how Edmonton's power play has been. But this has been a great series. I mean, Besser's been awesome for Vancouver. Miller's playing, I think, at a high level. But we got to shout out Archer Shilov's, Nick. I mean, he's been amazing for the Canucks in this series.
For somebody with no experience to be solid, very impressive. So 2 stats for you before we move on. Number 1, Stuart Skinner was 20th of 21 goalies in goals saved above expected. The only goalie worse, Connor Hellebuck, who only lasted 5 games in the first round. 877 save percentage in the playoffs. You can't win in the playoffs with that. No. It's that simple. And I don't think the Oilers can go all the way with Pickard as their goalie. That's just not tenable. They played a really good defensive game in game 4. He only had to make 19 saves, and they were able to win that game. It's a nice story. But I do think at some point the Oilers are going to need to go back to Skinner if they get to the next round. And that's just a really complicated goalie situation there. And then the last stat, to your point.
What about Jack Campbell, baby?
Jack Campbell is there to collect his direct deposit every 2 weeks and look pretty. The Oilers are 6-3-0 in these playoffs when they score first. That was the other stat I wanted to get in here. They score first. They're a lot better defensively because they can settle into the game as opposed to having to be perfect defensively, which builds off of the goaltending issue. And it's all interconnected. The Oilers are third in goals for in these playoffs. They are 14th in goals against in these playoffs. 16 teams make the playoffs. To be 14th in goals against and be in the second round, that's telling you something is majorly wrong. But coming up next, we are going to touch base over on Av Stars and Boston and Florida. Coming up next on Locked On NHL. Hockey fans, we are in the best stretch of the year. All of these second round playoff series have been incredible, forcing game fives, forcing game six over in the National Basketball Association. We've got real beef back in basketball. Dante DiVincenzo wants to fight Miles Turner. And you can win big, get in on the action over at FanDuel, and bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet, $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hello, everyone, and thank you very, very much for making Locked On NHL a part of your Thursday. Let's start with Dallas, Colorado, because that was played last night. That's a little bit fresher in everybody's mind.
That's what it looks like, baby. That's what
great hockey. Like. It's great hockey. You made the comparison the other day. That's what Alabama, Georgia, like 3 or 4 years ago looked like. They're playing at the highest tempo with the most intensity with the best talent. It's easily reminiscent of late 2010s SEC college football, where it's just faster than everything else. You look away from the screen for half a second and you missed an entire sequence because there's just so much talent everywhere. And I know Colorado's missing a lot of guys. The Nichushkin thing is weird and been very weirdly handled by a lot of different parties, but you saw their star players look around and say, I'm not ready for the season to end last night. It would have been very easy for the Stars to win that game. Colorado came storming back. You saw Makar make some plays. You saw McKinnon make some plays. Every now and then in the playoffs, you need one of your guys to look around and say, okay, no one else is going to make it happen tonight. I'll do it. And that's really the value in having that type of player, especially in a leadership position where he's going to look up and down the bench and say, okay, we've got nothing tonight. We cannot get anything going. I have to find a way. And that's invaluable this time of year. You need guys who can take that accountability and that responsibility and feel that it's personally their responsibility.
I thought Dallas was doing a tremendous job on McKinnon and Makar those first 4 games. I don't think they were getting that much offense, especially compared to how much they were getting against Winnipeg in the first round. But you saw in game 5, Makar and McKinnon were like, no, we're not losing this game. We're not having our season end in 5 games against this Stars team. We're going to take over this game. And that's exactly what they did, especially Makar. I thought Makar was the best player on the ice by far. Last night, he was making a lot of players look really silly in his own zone, especially also in the offensive zone. I thought Casey Middlestat also had a great game for the Avalanche. He woke up after a little bit of time off. Well, no, I shouldn't say time off, but a couple of mad games overall as well. And it was their big guns that pushed them to down 1 game in this series now to send this series back to Denver. And if they want to send this series back to Dallas for game 7, I think they're going to have to play at that level again. I said it on the show last week, but when Makar and McKinnon go into quote unquote God mode like that, there's really not much you can do. I mean, Dallas was playing, I thought, relatively fine in that game. They had a lead at times. They made a push late in the third period, but there's only so much even they can do when Makar and McKinnon just decide, we're not going to lose this game and we're going to go into 0 to 100 mode just in the snap of a finger. So that was awesome to watch. Again, Middlestat was great. I thought Georgiev also made some very big timely saves for them. I don't think that's being talked about enough on social media or other articles from the media. I thought he was great in that game, gave the Avalanche a chance to win. And even though they're missing a lot of guys, the Nichushkin thing, I just hope he gets the help that he needs overall. Devon Taves at least did come back in that game. They really missed him in game 4. When he's on the ice, the Avalanche are just great at controlling play. But yeah, man, this is Alabama, Georgia. This is Nick Saban versus Kirby Smart, at least when Saban was still coaching. It's 2 powerhouse teams just trading punches with one another. And I really hope that we get two more of in this series, just because, again, this really is what it looks like.
It's been tremendous hockey on every level. It's been highly entertaining, and it's a shame someone has to lose. It's a shame we can't just keep running those two teams back against each other. Over to Florida, Boston. Boston showed you a lot to come out and win that game 5. They didn't have a whole lot. Still no Marchand. Guys are dinged up. You see it on McAvoy's face. That's a really resilient team. And whether or not they can force a game 7, I think is, I don't want to say that's not the point. Obviously, if you're a Bruins fan, you want to hear us say they can find a way to make it happen. But so much of that Bruins team this season in general has been about just finding a way. And that's really the defining trait of that team. That look at all the guys who are contributing. Like James Van Riemsdyk has been like one of their best forwards the entire playoffs, who's on like a league minimum at 35 years old. We're talking about guys like Johnny Beecher, who have like no NHL experience. Lowride, the defenseman, who's got like no NHL experience. That team has shown you a lot. I think Florida has played the best of any team in these playoffs, probably. I think that's reasonable to say. For Boston, in the shape they're in, to get to a game 6, that's an accomplishment for that group. And I know that the consolation prizes, nobody's happy with that, but that Boston team should feel pretty good about itself to even be here.
I picked Florida in 6 to start this series. I just didn't think it would be this close when I picked Florida in 6 before it started, just because Boston is really giving Florida a good fight. They're playing really well defensively in their own zone. And just to piggyback off your JVR take, I mean, you look at his line with Trent Frederick and Brazo, I believe is how you pronounce
Brazo, yeah.
His last name. In 6 games, they have a 75% expected goal share. I mean, just keep riding that line. That line's been one of the best lines in the playoffs. It's top 10 among all lines in the playoffs in terms of expected goals so far. So if I were Jim Montgomery, I would keep riding that line. And, speaking of Montgomery, him and Maurice, that's a pretty fun coaching war going on in this series. You saw Montgomery doing the hilarious diving motion.
Very animated,
on the bench. That was great. You see Paul Maurice just being like, yeah, I felt like my players needed some profanity in their lives. That's a nice little underrated war for this series. But I think the biggest reason, Nick, why the Bruins have forced Game 6 is the play of Jeremy Swayman. They easily could have just said, you know what, we're going to go back to what we did during the regular season. We're going to go to Allmark just because we rotated one and then the other during the regular season. But you know what? They didn't do that. They've stuck with Swayman because he's been the best goalie for them in these playoffs, and he's rewarding them with his play. His save at the end of Game 5, I believe it was on Reinhart, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I have in my notes. That was a hell of a save. And he doesn't make that save. That game goes to overtime, and then who knows what happens at this point. But he has been a rock for the Bruins. TBD on whether Marchand is able to play on Thursday night. It would be massive if they could get him back.
He was skating this morning, regular jersey, so maybe. But that's the answer to your question.
But I'm just really impressed by how the Bruins are playing against the Panthers in this series, just because, I'll keep saying it, I think when the Panthers are humming, there's not a better team in the Eastern Conference, but the Bruins have been able to really frustrate the Panthers throughout this series, and they'll try to do it tonight. They have the opportunity to do a very funny thing after what happened last year. So really looking forward to this game. I do think also if the Bruins want to win this series, got to get Pasternak going a little bit more as well.
There's not a lot of room out there. That's the thing that's been really noticeable about that series is when the Bruins have played well, the games have been slogs. There's not a lot of space. There's not a lot of scoring chances. It's typically very tightly contested, and that's a reflection on it. But that Pasternak hasn't really had a huge impact. I think he only has 3 goals the entire playoffs, 4 goals, something like that. And we're talking about somebody who's been consistently 40, 50 goal guy in the regular season for basically the entirety of his career. We will be right back. We're going to talk about where these teams rank kind of in their odds to win the Stanley Cup, coming up next on Locked On NHL. Buying tickets for any event is a real pain. It is really frustrating. I'm going to I went to the Gametime app, used our friends, the only app I use to buy tickets, picked up tickets to go see Caitlin Clark's WNBA debut in the greater New York area. So I will be in attendance on Saturday. I bought my tickets on Gametime, the best features of any ticket buying app. All in pricing, where it shows you the price up front, no surprise fees when you get to checkout. The seat view, where you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets. Lowest price guaranteed. This is the best time of year, man. I'm exhausted pretty much every night because I'm up late watching hockey or working on something that I had to do based on watching hockey. And I wouldn't have it any other way. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see how barely open my eyes are. I am tired. I'm very tired. I can't wait to stay up till 2:30 in the morning tonight to watch the Oilers play the Canucks and then do a podcast about it. This is why you do stuff like this. This is the best time of year.
It is. I mean, mid-May, going into Memorial Day, going into June, this really is one of the best times of the year for sports. I would say early fall for, hockey coming back, college football coming back, and the NFL. That's a big
baseball playoffs all at once. Yeah.
But this one, you get hockey basically every single day until the Stanley Cup final. Then, you have a couple days off between games usually, or at least one day off between games. But until the conference finals end, you get a day of hockey every single day, and you get the NBA playoffs as well in there, which have been really fun to watch too. But I love staying up to watch these Vancouver Edmonton games. I don't care that they start at 10, 10:30 and go until 12:30, 1 a.m., perhaps even later. I'm a late night owl no matter what. I stay up till 1:30 every night. That's just how I am. I've been like that for the last year and a half. But I mean, when the playoffs come around like this, there's just no better time. I think the Stanley Cup playoffs continue to be the best playoffs in all sports.
100%. All right. Let's talk about it. What team do you have first?
So I have Dallas at number 1 in my rankings. I think with the way the Stars have played, especially in the second round, they've played like the best team in the league in the way that they've been able to really stifle Colorado's attack outside of Game 5. They're just playing like a well-oiled machine right now. And I said this during Locked On Penguins with my co-host Pat on Wednesday. If the Stars are able to get to the Stanley Cup final, this will be one of the best things I think I've ever seen for as long as I've been watching the playoffs, just because of the road that they will have had to take to get to the final, Nick. Going through Vegas, going through Colorado, going through one of Edmonton or Vancouver. I mean, those 3 teams, 3 to 4 teams, I should say, no slouches at all. Very tough matchups. But if the Stars are able to do that and then potentially even beat whoever comes out of the East, whether it's Florida or New York, I mean, that's just one of the best runs in quite some time. But the Stars, they're playing like the top team in the league. I have them number 1.
I have them number 1 as well. The debate for me was between Dallas or Florida number 1. I think the only reason I have Dallas ahead of Florida ever so slightly is that I think Dallas will, if Dallas wins, I think Dallas absolutely makes mincemeat of Edmonton or Vancouver. I don't think either of those teams has the depth to hang around with Dallas. Whereas Florida, I think Carolina or the Rangers can give Florida a decent series and make that competitive, where they'll be a favorite, Florida, but not in the same vein as Dallas would. Who do you have second?
Yeah, I actually do have Florida at my number 2. I think they're playing like the best team in the East right now. And I do agree, if Florida does advance back to the conference final and they get one of New York or Carolina, I think the Panthers should be the favorite against either of those 2 teams. I think when they're humming, they're better than those 2. I have Florida as my number 2, followed actually by the Rangers. I think the Rangers, even though they've been struggling the past couple games, I have them at my number 3. They're still ahead of Carolina, though obviously that can change if Carolina forces Game 7 or potentially pulls off this reverse sweep.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Rangers have shown you a really high ceiling in these playoffs, but at the same time, That ceiling is kind of tenuous in how you assemble it, treading water at 5-on-5, dominant special teams and goaltending. It's volatile when you play that way. And it's not a coincidence the worst game the Rangers played all postseason, they didn't convert on the power play. And in game 4, they didn't score. Game 5, they didn't score on. No, game 4, I was right. And game 4, they didn't score on the power play either. They got goals from guys like Cooley, Gaudreau. And the third goal, I want to say was, I forget who scored the third goal, but it wasn't someone in the top 6. It wasn't somebody who usually scores. So with that in mind, I think the Rangers can definitely give Florida a competitive series. I have Carolina 4th. I think Carolina has shown you a lot of resolve. And I know a lot of people would probably say, how come Edmonton or Vancouver? No, I think Edmonton and Vancouver, that's going to be a really tall ask to ask one of those teams to beat Dallas or Colorado. That's why it's not that I don't think Edmonton or Vancouver could do it. I just think it's more likely that Carolina could beat Florida as opposed to Edmonton or Vancouver beating Dallas.
I have Carolina at number 5. I actually have Colorado at number 4. So just because of the way they played in game 5 and the way I just really liked their game for, especially in the first round. I know the second round, not as much, but I still think, when I look at them compared to some of the other teams in the playoffs, I still think they're better than Carolina. I think even though Colorado is still a bit banged up, I think they would beat one of Edmonton or Vancouver if they got to the conference final. That's just how much I believe in Colorado's core overall. But I do have Carolina at 5. I have them also a little bit ahead of Vancouver, Edmonton. It's just the way they've been playing the last couple of games that kind of just pushes them a little bit over the other two West teams and then over Boston as well. These rankings have been really hard to do just because of how close these series are and just how close these teams are overall as well.
Completely agreed with you in that respect. Next up, I have Colorado 5th. So I definitely can see where you're coming from there. I just think based on the way the series have played out, I think it's a little more likely Carolina can win tonight and then on Saturday as opposed to Colorado doing tomorrow and Sunday, but very close series. Then I have Edmonton and Vancouver back to back. I think I have Edmonton ever so slightly ahead of Vancouver just because Vancouver hasn't played well, like at all. Neither has Edmonton, but at least Edmonton's star players have showed up. And maybe you can make the argument Vancouver should be ahead of them because they've gotten this far with pretty much just JT Miller and Brock Besser doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And that if Pettersson gets going, they've already got Hughes playing at a pretty high level, and maybe Thatcher Demko's lurking in the wings somewhere. Maybe you add all of that up, there's a better argument for Vancouver over Edmonton, but you give me the option of McDavid and Draisaitl or Pettersson and JT Miller. I'm taking McDavid and Draisaitl, and then I'm going to cross my fingers when Ryan McLeod and Evander Kane are out there.
See, I'm going to do the opposite. I have Vancouver just a tad over Edmonton. I like the way Vancouver's been playing, especially late in the periods. And if they can play at that level earlier in the game, I think they'll be able to win this series. It's been obviously very tight throughout. You can honestly flip a coin for these two spots and you can put them however you want. But I just have Vancouver with the way Sheelovs is playing in net. He's giving the Canucks a big boost there. I think he's been better than both the Oilers goalies in this series. I know Picard's, that's one game, so small sample size, I get it. But he's obviously been a lot better than Skinner. I'm going to go with Vancouver just because of how, best of 3, they have home ice. I think they're going to be able to get this done, but no one should be surprised if Edmonton wins. It's just because they do have the high-end talent advantage, and it's been evident in this series. And then I have Edmonton 7, and then I do have Boston 8. Not trying to disrespect the Bruins. They were giving the Panthers one hell of a fight.
It's just so uphill. It's so uphill.
It is. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not that realistically any of these teams that is behind in these series is good enough where they could get to a game 7 and then anything can happen in a game 7. Yes. And then off of that, you can do anything in a conference finals because it's one of the biggest frustrations I've had. I've seen a lot of Canucks people, both in the media and just fans, saying, well, if the Oilers can barely beat the Canucks who aren't playing well, how are they going to beat Dallas? Don't tell me that. Then what's the point? Why are we playing the games? Anything can happen if we play the games. Don't tell me, well, they can't come back. They're not, even if they get to the next round, they're not. Okay, let's see it happen first. Let's see them play the games, and then we can have a conversation about, well, the Oilers were a flawed team. Let's see them get there first, then we can start making fun of them. The Bruins very easily can win tomorrow night and force a game 7, and you got Swayman staring down Bob. Neither of those guys is going to blink. That should be is a charged up a game 7 with the external factors of Marchand coming back and the real animosity building between those two teams. Anything can happen in a game 7. Lest we forget, the St. Louis Blues went into TD Garden and beat the Bruins in game 7 of the Stanley Cup final 4-1. Dog walked them. Not a soul on earth thought the Bruins were going to lose a game 7 at home to a Blues team that wasn't that good. But that's why we play the games.
Buddy, we can go back even further than that. 2009 Penguins Red Wings. I don't think a lot of people were picking the Penguins to go into the Joe and beat the Red Wings, one of the best teams of the Cap era, and win the Stanley Cup. But that's exactly what they did, because that's why you play the games. You got a legendary performance from someone like Max Talbot. You had Marc-Andre Fleury play a great game. The Penguins won that game a lot in the third period without the services of Crosby, just because he got a bit banged up in that game. So again, this is why you play the games, man. And I'm really excited to see how all of these series end up.
That will do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. Hunter and I will talk to you guys next Thursday. Until then, enjoy the Stanley Cup playoffs. Please, Rangers, win this game.